when a sealed envelope is found tucked inside an old recipe book, addressed to a girl who died decades ago, a quiet unease settles over the village of St. Mary Mead. Welcome, dear listener. Come in. Make yourself comfortable. Miss Marple is already seated, her knitting in hand, and the truth, as always, is waiting to be uncovered. Where are you joining us from today? What time is it for you now? And how has your day been so far? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from you, and it helps others discover these mysteries too. Now, find something warm to sip, get comfortable, and let's begin. Mrs. Caldwell had been, in her own quiet way, something of a legend in St. Mary Mead. Not because she was loud or particularly sociable, indeed quite the opposite, but because she had cooked for 3 generations of Ashleys at Greythorn Hall, and was known to be the only soul who could replicate Lady Ashley's vanished family trifle, which had, for some reason, required cloves, ginger wine, and silence during preparation. Her death came in the night, as soft as the rising mist over the vicarage lawn. Mrs. Baker, who brought her milk each morning, was the one to discover her, sitting upright in her kitchen chair, spectacles perched on her nose, and an empty teacup at her side. She had, it seemed, simply stopped. At the church tea that followed her burial, a modest affair held 2 days later, her name was spoken fondly, if not often. "A plain woman, but capable," said Mrs. Bantry, stirring her cup. She always kept herself to herself. "Remarkably tidy handwriting," added Miss Hartnell, who'd once received a holiday recipe from her. "And no fuss, very proper." Miss Marple, seated a little apart from the louder voices, allowed a soft smile to rise at these reflections. She had not known Mrs. Caldwell well, but well enough. There had always been something closed about her, like a book with one too many pressed flowers between its pages, weighty, quiet, and never quite opened. When Reverend Calthorpe announced that some of Mrs. Caldwell's effects had been donated to the church fete, including her famed handwritten recipe book, no one found it unusual. Mrs. Caldwell had no family nearby, and certainly no heirs of any real acquaintance. What she had left behind was the ordinary sort of thing: aprons, baking tins, and a life remembered only in glances. The summer fete was held as ever on the vicarage lawn, beneath bunting saved from Coronation Day, and with lemon sponge served from trestle tables. There was a stiff breeze which carried both the scent of roses and the shrill commentary of Miss Weatherby on the jam competition. It was, by village standards, a fine day. The items donated for auction were displayed beside the tombola: a silver-backed hairbrush from Mrs. Bantry, 2 pressed glass vases of uncertain color from Dr. Hayward's wife, and placed modestly toward the back, Mrs. Caldwell's recipe book. It was bound in brown cloth, fraying gently at the edges, and tied shut with twine, as if still preserving secrets from the heat of the stove. Miss Marple, drawn to it not by curiosity but out of that particular attentiveness, cultivated over years of observation, lifted it lightly from its place. She felt at once the weight of it, not physical, but personal. The pages within were thick with handwritten entries: rhubarb crumble, steak and kidney pie, gooseberry fool. Each one annotated in a script so fine and measured it might have been etched with a needle. "Who would have thought," murmured Mrs. Bantry, peering over Miss Marple's shoulder, "that such a book could be so dear? It's like looking into someone's soul, isn't it?" "It's a sort of history," Miss Marple replied, turning a page slowly. "Only told in teaspoons and timings, rather than years." There was a slight hush as the book was held up for bids. It was Clarissa Blake, the young widow of Philip Blake, who secured it with a quiet bid, though it was widely noted that she handed it to Miss Marple to look after for the afternoon, while she went to help with the tea service. And so it was that the book, with its soft-spoken presence and faint scent of nutmeg, returned with Miss Marple to her spot beneath the hawthorn tree. She turned the pages idly, not seeking anything in particular, until she came to the pudding section. It was tucked between the instructions for Christmas plum pudding and a sweat variation dated 1927. Not in ink, as the rest of the entries were, but in faded pencil, the sort that suggested hesitation and second thoughts. A note, neatly folded, yet visibly worn at the creases. Miss Marple's fingers paused upon it. She glanced toward the laughter near the jam stall, then back to the book. The pencil was barely legible, the pressure light, but the words could still be made out. Forgive me. It was never meant to be her. There was no name, no date, no signature, just that. A line that hung in the air like steam from a kettle, scentless, but undeniable. Miss Marple read it again. The writing bore none of the crisp confidence of Mrs. Caldwell's culinary script. This was softer, more tremulous, the hand of someone not practiced in confession, or perhaps someone trying very hard to hide one. She folded it again, gently, slipped it back into place, closed the book. Mrs. Bantry had returned, red-faced from exertion, and faintly powdered with icing sugar. "Anything worth noting, Jane?" "Only the usual," Miss Marple replied with a calm that was almost practiced. "And a rather fine recipe for plum pudding, though I dare say there's a great deal more beneath the surface." It was an ordinary phrase, quite meaningless to anyone else. But Miss Marple sat a little straighter in her chair, her gaze drifting not toward the fete, but toward the edge of the lawn, where Clarissa Blake was standing, still as a statue, her eyes fixed not on the stalls, but on the vicarage window, where the recipe book had briefly lain. The breeze shifted, the note remained in its place, and Miss Marple, without another word, began to think. The fete lingered into the soft golden hush of late afternoon, and beneath the bunting that swayed like faded ribbons of memory, the conversation turned, as it so often did in St. Mary Mead, to the interestingly trivial. It was during a lull between sponge judging and the start of the three-legged race that the vicar's daughter, prim and cheerfully unaware, made her observation. "I did see something quite peculiar in that old recipe book," she said, reaching for a Victoria sandwich. "A little note, I think, between puddings. It looked like someone had written it in pencil, all very mysterious." There was a pause, not long, but enough. Mrs. Bantry's brow lifted. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had previously been locked in silent disapproval over the winning cherry preserve, turned ever so slightly in her chair. "A note, did you say?" asked Mrs. Bantry, with interest that belied its mild tone. "From dear Mrs. Caldwell?" "I don't think it was signed," said the girl with the unconcern of youth. "It said something rather odd. I only caught a glance. Something about never meant to be her. Probably nonsense, or a shopping list gone astray." Miss Marple, seated just beyond the jam stall, listened without turning her head. Her eyes, pale and clear, remained on the hem-stitching in her lap, but her mind, sharp as a bodkin, had already registered the shift in air. Speculation fluttered through the fete like a breeze that lifted curtain corners and memories alike. Clarissa Blake, who had been chatting with the vicar near the lemonade stand, had stiffened almost imperceptibly. Dr. Hayward looked up from the tombola ledger, frowning as though the phrase struck some distant chord. "I dare say," Miss Hartnell offered, that it may have to do with that niece of hers, the one who left under peculiar circumstances." "No niece," corrected Mrs. Bantry, who knew the lineage of every cottage dweller within 3 parishes. "Only a girl from the Hall who worked with her years ago. Ran off, if memory serves." "Well," said Mrs. Price Ridley, sniffing delicately, "one never truly knows what happens in kitchens after dark. Things bubble up." Miss Marple did not comment, but the thread in her sewing had paused. Gossip, she knew, was rarely malicious in St. Mary Mead. It was, however, often accurate, particularly when passed beneath bunting, sponge crumbs, and the low murmur of things half-remembered. The recipe book had been returned to Miss Marple's care for safekeeping, until Clarissa Blake could collect it properly. It sat neatly beside her tea tray at home, unassuming yet strangely weighted, as though its pages retained not only ingredients, but intentions. That evening, in the hush of a room touched only by ticking clock and distant bird song, Miss Marple reopened it. Turning to the plum pudding recipe once more, she gently felt along the spine. Not out of suspicion precisely, but from long acquaintance with human habit. People, in her experience, often tucked what they most feared to lose between the comforting folds of the everyday. Behind the pudding instructions, folded not once but thrice, was a photograph. It was black and white, slightly curled, the corners blunted with time. A girl no more than 17 stood beside a stone wall, apron tied high at the waist, a fringe brushing her brow in the fashion of the late 1920s. Her smile was tentative. There was something behind her eyes, not quite fear, but something alert, expectant. On the back, in the same neat hand used throughout the book, were the words, "Edith, Christmas at the Hall." The name meant nothing to most, but to Miss Marple, who had known of an Edith who fell from the stairs of the Hall under murky circumstances some 20 years prior, it stirred a note not unlike the one in the book, faint, unfinished, and wrong. She placed the photograph beside her spectacles. It seemed, she thought, that Mrs. Caldwell had left behind more than recipes. She had left behind a question, and perhaps, somewhere beneath the bunting and beneath the years, an answer that no longer wished to stay hidden. It was Miss Hartnell who first raised the matter, though not directly, and only in the cautious manner of those who sense the presence of ghosts best left undisturbed. "Well, of course," she said, folding a napkin with more precision than required. "There was that business at the Hall. Years ago, of course. A fire, though no one quite recalls what started it." "Oh, yes," murmured Mrs. Bantry, who did recall, though one would never know it from her tone. "The West Wing, if I'm not mistaken. Rather sudden, and very hush-hush afterward." The vicar's wife, who had been retying the ribbons on a prize marrow, added carefully, "I believe a young maid was dismissed not long after." Edith, was it? There was some unpleasantness. No one used the word scandal. It hung in the air nonetheless. Miss Marple, knitting quietly at the edge of the table, did not look up. She knew the rhythm of this sort of conversation well, the gentle nudging at a memory's edge, the drawing of a curtain half open. And she knew, too, that Mrs. Caldwell had been present at the Hall in those days. Not merely present, but established, trusted. "I always thought it odd," Miss Hartnell continued, "that no inquiry was made. You'd expect a formal report for any fire, but it was all swept away. And then, of course, the girl vanished." "It's a curious thing," Miss Marple said softly, without looking at anyone in particular. "How some memories burn brightly for years, while others seem to vanish in smoke." Her words, like ash, settled without stirring the air. But across the fete lawn, she noticed Clarissa Blake pause in conversation. Just a slight turn of the head. Nothing more. It was Mrs. Dawn, who assisted at the post office 3 days a week and knew every path through the village by the wear on its letters, who first mentioned the visits. "I've seen her go more than once," she remarked to Miss Marple during a quiet Tuesday exchange of stamps and pleasantries. "Clarissa Blake, to Elsie Weatherby's cottage, and always looking over her shoulder, too, as if she were meeting someone not quite meant to be seen. Elsie Weatherby had served once at the Hall, years ago, and had been close with Mrs. Caldwell. Now long retired, she lived on the edge of the village, in a small red brick cottage with ivy curling over the eaves like a secret. That afternoon, while delivering a parcel of preserves to the church pantry, Miss Marple glimpsed Clarissa approaching Elsie's gate. There was no knock, only a brief pause, a glance back over her shoulder, and the door opened swiftly from within. The encounter lasted no more than 5 minutes, but when Clarissa left, her face was pale and taut, and she did not return the way she came. Later that week, at tea with Mrs. Bantry, the vicar's daughter once again mentioned the curious note in the recipe book, laughing lightly at her own indiscretion. But it was Clarissa who faltered in her reply, her teaspoon slipping against her saucer with a clink too sharp for the moment. "Oh," she said, her voice tight. "That. I hadn't thought. I mean, it was surely nothing." And beside her, Elsie Weatherby, who had joined the tea under some coaxing from Mrs. Price Ridley, went suddenly, noticeably still. Her eyes dropped to her lap. She did not speak for several minutes. Miss Marple observed this with the air of someone not yet forming conclusions, but gently weighing them, one thread at a time. The air in Clarissa Blake's parlor was cool, despite the warmth outside. Pale light filtered through lace curtains, pooling softly on a table set for 2. Miss Marple, having brought back the borrowed shawl in question, found herself politely detained for tea, as she had perhaps anticipated. Clarissa, slender in a navy cardigan that hung too loosely at the shoulders, moved with a sort of gentleness that one associates with grief not freshly felt, but deeply woven in. "I do hope it wasn't a bother," she said, pouring the tea. "The shawl must have clung to your garden chair when I visited. These things have a way of disappearing." Miss Marple accepted the cup with a quiet smile. "They do indeed, particularly when they've overheard something they weren't meant to." Clarissa gave a soft, uncertain laugh. "It's rather strange, isn't it, how objects outlive us? Or nearly so. Like that recipe book of Mrs. Caldwell's." There was a pause. Miss Marple stirred her tea once. "You knew her well, then?" Clarissa nodded slowly. "She was cook at the Hall when I first came to visit Philip's family. Goodness, I must have been 20. I was quite in awe of her, to be truthful. She was one of those women who seemed to know everything without asking. And she remembered everyone's favorites." "Did she remain in service long?" "Until shortly before Philip left for the war. After everything changed, I think she wanted quieter days." Clarissa's voice softened, and her gaze drifted to the window. "Philip never liked to speak of those times. He carried things, the kind one never quite names." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "And yet he was not a man to burden others with them, I imagine." "No," Clarissa said. "But I always had the feeling that Mrs. Caldwell knew, not because she was told, but because she'd seen it before. Perhaps in someone else." There was a long moment of silence. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower buzzed faintly, and was gone again. Clarissa looked back at her guest, her eyes searching, not for answers, but perhaps for permission to let something unspoken remain that way. Miss Marple sipped her tea. There are some who understand more than they say. They bake it into their bread and fold it into their linens, but occasionally they leave behind a line or two. Clarissa said nothing, but her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the sugar. It was the following morning when Miss Marple, walking a roundabout path to the village shop, found herself quite near the ivy-tangled gate of Elsie Weatherby's cottage. She paused, not long enough to be impolite, but enough to be noticed. Elsie opened the door with the caution of habit. Her hair was set in soft curlers beneath a net, and her eyes, sharp and lined, held a trace of old recognition. "Well now," she said, "you've not come this way in a while, Miss Marple." "I was admiring your nasturtiums," Miss Marple replied, which was technically true. "So full of fire this season, much like the old west wing of Greythorn Hall, if I recall." Elsie didn't smile. She stood back, just a fraction. "You'd better come in." The inside of her cottage was neat and sparse, with only a few relics of her days in service. A small pewter dish, a framed drawing of the Hall's rose garden. She poured tea without asking. "They've started talking again, haven't they?" Elsie said. "About the girl." Miss Marple inclined her head. "About many things, I'm afraid. Notes, photographs, and a pudding recipe that seems to stir more than Christmas memories." Elsie set her cup down, hard enough to make a sound. "It should have burned, that wing. All of it. The note, the ledger, the things she kept." "She?" Elsie's lips pressed thin. "Mrs. Caldwell knew. She didn't speak of it, not to me directly, but I saw the way she looked at the girl. Edith was her concern, not out of affection, but obligation. Something had been promised. Or forgiven." "And the fire?" Miss Marple asked gently. "There was a reason no one questioned it." Elsie's voice dropped. The hall had too many ghosts by then. It was easier to let one more smolder quietly than to ask why the stairs creaked at midnight. She looked up at Miss Marple then, a gaze sharp enough to cut. "But ghosts don't stay quiet forever, do they? Especially when someone tries to write them out." Miss Marple folded her hands around her cup. "Number. They have a habit of returning, usually just as the kettle boils." The matter of solicitors, Miss Marple often thought, was not unlike the matter of undertakers. One rarely wished to engage them, but found them terribly useful when the occasion arose. So it was with Mr. Leonard Quayle, recently retired from a long London practice and newly installed in one of the renovated cottages near the chapel. He was a soft-spoken man with thinning silver hair and a manner so reserved it seemed lacquered into place. They met, as many do in St. Mary Mead, at the post office. Miss Marple, waiting to collect a parcel of embroidery threads, greeted him with a gentle courtesy, and he responded with the mild diffidence of one unsure whether social custom required anything more. A conversation bloomed cautiously over postal rates and the unreliability of London trains. As they walked a short way together, Miss Marple, in that delicate way of hers, turned the topic to Mrs. Caldwell. "She must have left her affairs in some order," she remarked. "One often hopes to do the same, though few of us possess quite her sense of tidiness." Mr. Quayle paused. "Indeed, I knew her only through one interaction, but I was struck by her decisiveness. It's not often a client wishes to draw up a letter and request it never be read." Miss Marple turned slightly. "Ah, then she had a solicitor before you." "Oh, she wasn't a client of mine in the formal sense," he replied, adjusting his pace. "It was in 1947, I believe. I'd been invited to speak at the hall on matters of estate planning. Mrs. Caldwell approached me after, and asked whether I'd hold a letter in trust, on the understanding it was to be returned to her, unopened or destroyed at her command. And was it? He nodded. Returned, yes. Just under a year ago. She wrote to me by post, asked it be sent back into her possession, without delay. Miss Marple tilted her head. Curious timing. Very. He agreed. But she struck me as the sort of woman who understood time more deeply than most. The letter, I gathered, was not for the law, nor for family, but for something else. Closure, perhaps. They parted at the green. Mr. Quayle, folding his umbrella, though no rain threatened, wished her a good afternoon. Miss Marple watched him go, her thoughts circling not around the man himself, but the woman who had chosen him, of all people, to safeguard her final unspoken word. Letters, she reflected, were not always written to be read. Sometimes they were written to be returned, as a reckoning, or a reminder. Miss Marple did not often walk to Greythorn Hall. The grounds had long since grown somewhat unkempt since the Ashley family moved abroad, and the hall was now let out to seasonal tenants who, quite sensibly, kept mostly to themselves. But memories, Miss Marple knew, had longer leases than property ever did. It was at the post office, under the modest excuse of sending for a back issue of the Times Literary Supplement, that Miss Marple engaged Mr. Merriweather in a passing remark about household registries. He, being a retired schoolmaster with a love for administrative detail, proved most obliging. "Oh, yes," he said, rifling through a bundle of old parish newsletters. The hall used to employ 23 staff at its peak, quite a show of Edwardian extravagance. "And there was a maid," Miss Marple said lightly, "who fell on the stairs." Mr. Merriweather adjusted his glasses. "Ah, you mean Edith, scullery maid. It was just after the Christmas ball, in 1910, I believe. A terrible accident, so it was said. She'd been dismissed only the day before." "Dismissed?" Miss Marple asked, her voice mildly surprised. "Well, it wasn't made public, but word got round. She'd been in some kind of difficulty. No family to speak of course. There was talk of a gentleman. Always is in these cases. And the fall? Well, it was chalked up to clumsiness and a broken heel. But not everyone agreed. There were murmurs, he admitted. One of the footmen left not long after. And Mrs. Caldwell, she was cook then, took a leave of absence and never quite came back. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Curious how these things vanish from the records, but never quite from the air." Mr. Merriweather gave a thin smile. "Precisely. What's written in ledgers tells you what happened, but what's spoken over tea tells you why." Later that afternoon, as Miss Marple sipped a quiet cup in her parlor, the line from the recipe book returned to her again. "Forgive me. It was never meant to be her." She thought of Edith, dismissed, disgraced, dead on the stairs, and Mrs. Caldwell, who had lived with her silence for half a lifetime. Some mistakes, she thought, were not accidents at all, but substitutions. Someone had meant to push a secret down the stairs. Instead, they had pushed a girl. The vicarage, though not expansive, had developed its own form of local clutter, pamphlets, choir robes, jam labels, and most usefully for Miss Marple's purposes, old Sunday school ledgers and confirmation diaries stacked in a modest cupboard behind the vestry. It was while helping Mrs. Calthorpe arrange hymnals for the upcoming harvest festival that Miss Marple asked, as if idly, about the church's older records. "Oh, goodness," said Mrs. Calthorpe, balancing a basket of tea towels. "I'm not even sure what's still legible in those. Some of them go back to Reverend Trench's time, well before my husband's. But you're welcome to look. There's a diary from the Ladies' Aid Committee that used to record everything. Everything, she repeated with mild exasperation. From parish bake sales, to what brand of soap was used, to clean the baptismal font. Miss Marple smiled. Then I'm sure it will be enlightening. The diary in question was bound in green leather, its corners worn to soft suede. Its pages, neatly scripted, traced years of events in the life of the village. And there, in an entry from January 1911, sandwiched between a note on pew polishing and an order for altar candles, was the line that brought Miss Marple's hand to a stillness. Mrs. Caldwell declined committee duty again. Seems distracted. Said, when pressed, "I kept quiet to protect the wrong one." No elaboration, no names. But the implication was unmistakable. She had kept quiet, and not in innocence. Miss Marple closed the book softly. The confession, such as it was, had been scrawled in a time when women spoke truth only in kitchens or between stitches at the Mothers' Union. And the question now was, whom had she shielded? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to those who remained, or returned. Clarissa Blake, whose grief ran too deep for what was said. Elsie Weatherby, who knew the fire should have taken more. And now, Mr. Quayle, too smooth to be entirely incidental. It was a web spun decades ago, and one thread at a time. The past was beginning to tremble. There were certain things Miss Marple had come to understand about the dead. They often spoke more clearly after death than in life, and they spoke when they did, through paper. Paper and the choices etched upon it. It was with this thought that she found herself in quiet conversation with Mr. Winthrop at the village library. Not a solicitor by trade, but a clerk of some minor repute who had once assisted in estate matters for the late Mrs. Wetherington. He was also the sort of man who liked people to know that he knew things, provided they were asked with just the right air of decorous curiosity. "You knew Mrs. Caldwell, of course," Miss Marple began, gently returning a borrowed volume of gardening law. "I understand she put her affairs in order rather thoroughly toward the end." Mr. Winthrop, who never refused a conversational nibble when it dangled in respectable tones, nodded. "Oh, yes, quite a tidy business. She made a formal revision to her will, not something one sees often in someone of her means. Nothing grand, you understand, but deliberate. She had no children, I believe." "None," he confirmed. "No spouse, no siblings living. One might have expected it to be left to the church or a domestic charity. But in the revised version, dated just last spring, everything was left to Mrs. Clarissa Blake." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if this surprised her not in the least. How thoughtful of her. The connection was an old one, I gather. Mr. Winthrop gave a small shrug. "Yes, though it's not quite the usual arrangement. The earlier version had left what little there was to a cousin, Mr. Ellery in Cheltenham. Quite distant, but he was removed in full." "And the change? Was there any reason offered?" "None that I'm aware of," said Mr. Winthrop. "But it was her own hand that signed the amendment, all witnessed, all proper." Miss Marple walked home slowly. The shift in the will, subtle though it was, altered the lines of the picture she had been mentally piecing together. One does not leave a modest but entire estate to a passing acquaintance out of whim. Nor does one do so merely from affection. Not unless that affection carries a weight shaped like guilt. Perhaps Mrs. Caldwell had intended it as recompense, or perhaps as a final burden. She had left Clarissa something that would remain after the furniture was cleared and the baking tins divided. The knowledge that whatever had passed, long ago in stairwells and silence, was no longer fully buried. The recipe book, the photograph, the note, and now this legal testament. Each was a breadcrumb, left with quiet deliberation, and Clarissa Blake, for all her composure, had not looked surprised at their discovery, only afraid. It was the postman, Mr. Tilley, who found her. On his morning rounds, he noticed that the curtains of Elsie Weatherby's cottage remained drawn, the morning milk still sitting untouched on the stoop, its bottle sweating in the sunlight. He knocked, hesitated, and then, prompted by something indefinable, perhaps instinct or perhaps the peculiar hush that sometimes precedes disaster, called for the constable. By the time Constable Peck broke open the door, the cottage was thick with the odor of gas. Elsie lay slumped in her armchair, an afghan tangled around her feet. The stove's knobs had been turned, every one of them. Though no flame had caught, she survived. Barely. They said it was an accident, a doddering mistake, the sort of thing that happens when one grows forgetful or confused by the morning. But Miss Marple did not believe in accidents that so precisely echoed fear. "She's not absent-minded," she said quietly to Dr. Hayward, who had been called to tend to Elsie. "I've known her since before the Great War. She's never once forgotten to trim her roses, let alone leave the gas on." Dr. Hayward, though kind, gave the sort of non-committal shrug physicians reserve for matters outside their remit. "I dare say she's been under a strain," he admitted. "Old memories, old injuries. They return in unexpected ways." But Miss Marple was not convinced. The timing was too deliberate. Only days after their conversation about the fire, about the girl. Only days after Clarissa's odd visit. And then there was the matter of Elsie's purse, which had been turned inside out, her biscuit tin upended. No money was taken. But something else had gone. A scrap of folded paper, a photograph, perhaps. Something light, small, but heavy with implication. Miss Marple said nothing aloud. But within her mind, the old machinery ticked quietly, comparing gestures and glances, the absence of sound and the presence of too much quiet. Elsie Weatherby had once said the fire should have burned more than it did. Someone, it seemed, agreed, and had come back to finish the job. That same evening, as the village steeple rang its 10:30, something occurred at the vicarage that would pass unnoticed by most, but not by Miss Marple. The next morning, Mrs. Calthorpe discovered that the study window had been left slightly ajar. Nothing appeared to be missing. The candlesticks were in place, the silver untouched. But the sense of disturbance hung in the air like a faint draught. It was only when the vicar's daughter, tending to the fate remnants in the church hall, remarked that the recipe book seemed lighter that anything was thought amiss. "The note," she said suddenly, eyes widening. "The little penciled note. It's gone." Miss Marple, who had arrived just in time to hear this, said nothing for a moment. Her eyes moved over the table, the closed book, and the hands of the girl who had spoken. "Are you quite certain?" she asked gently. "Oh, yes. It was still there yesterday, between the pudding pages. No fingerprints, no broken glass, just an absence where once there had been a confession." Inspector Craddock, summoned discreetly from county, examined the window latch and muttered about latch springs and overzealous drafts. But when Miss Marple mentioned that the kitchen door had been unlatched that morning, he paused. "You think it was taken deliberately?" he asked her later. "I think," Miss Marple replied softly, "that someone very much wanted to rewrite the past, and that when words prove too heavy, they simply remove them." The note was gone, but the shadow it cast was growing longer by the hour. Clarissa Blake, once spoken of with nothing more than gentle pity, now found herself eyed with more than village curiosity. She had known Mrs. Caldwell. She had been seen at Elsie Weatherby's cottage, twice. She had received, as many now recalled with furrowed brows, the full contents of the deceased's modest estate. Inspector Craddock spoke to her at length, not unkindly, but with the firm patience of a man trained to notice the difference between grief and evasion. Clarissa remained calm, pale, yes, and withdrawn, but composed. "She was very dear to me," she said, "more than most ever knew." "And the note?" Craddock asked, his tone deceptively casual. "Did you read it?" Clarissa's hands fluttered once, bird-like, then stilled. "Number, I only heard of it afterwards. I didn't know she had written anything at all." But Miss Marple had watched her response closely. Not for what she said, but for the momentary glaze in her eyes. Not confusion, but the struggle of recalling precisely which lie had already been told. If Clarissa had drawn attention, it was Mr. Leonard Quayle whose manner began to alter most markedly. Once affable in a reserved professional way, he now kept to his cottage with increasing regularity. When seen at the grocer's, he spoke quickly and with little warmth. When nodding to neighbors, he avoided eye contact entirely. Miss Marple, passing him on the green, noted that he no longer carried his walking stick, not because he had grown spry, but as though unwilling to draw notice with anything too distinctive. When she inquired gently after his health, he replied too swiftly that he was quite well. "Just preoccupied, you know. Letters from the old firm and such." But Miss Marple had observed the tremor in his fingers, the hesitation before he answered, the flicker of calculation in a man who once exuded calm discretion. The walls of silence were trembling now, and Mr. Quayle, whether by guilt, by fear, or by memory, seemed to be bracing for something that had already begun to arrive. Miss Marple was not one to disturb dust without cause, but when she requested access to the archive room at Greythorn Hall, now overseen by a Mrs. Linton, a retired schoolmistress who took pride in local history, she did so with both care and purpose. The hall, though no longer in the Ashley family, had preserved its records out of a sense of country orderliness. Ledgers, menus, garden plans, and staff registries were stored in an oaken cabinet beneath the back staircase. It was there, behind a drawer that groaned with age and long disuse, that Miss Marple found what she had suspected might remain, the staff logbook for the year 1910. The entries were meticulous, dates, names, wages, and beside each entry, comments made in the head housekeeper's firm hand. Under "scullery maid," one name stood out not because it was bold, but because it had been written in smaller, fainter ink. Edith Blackwood. Blackwood, the maiden name of Clarissa. A line had been drawn through the entry. Next to it, the words, "Dismissed, 21st December," and on the facing page, a terse note, "Fell from landing, deceased, no further elaboration, no mention of inquiry." Miss Marple rested her hand on the open book. So Edith had not simply been a maid. She had been Clarissa's elder sister, likely illegitimate, or perhaps disowned by a family, already burdened by reputation. She had been employed at the Hall during a time when appearances mattered more than compassion, and dismissed under a veil of quiet shame. And Clarissa, too young perhaps to understand then, or too shielded to resist. But the truth, once repressed, had not stayed buried. Mrs. Caldwell had known. She had been there, in the kitchen, aware of the girl's identity and the danger that surrounded her. This wasn't merely about a forgotten servant. This was about blood. Clarissa had lived with the ghost of a sister no one acknowledged, and Mrs. Caldwell, with the guilt of having protected the wrong person. Miss Marple gently closed the ledger. Some names vanish from history because no one thinks to record them. others because someone chooses not to. But names, like guilt, have a way of returning, especially when hidden in narrow script and quiet kitchens. After service the following Sunday, Miss Marple found herself invited to tea in the vicarage parlour, where the donation records were being prepared for the annual harvest account. She observed the vicar's daughter carefully listing names and sums in the register, and when the girl excused herself to fetch more ink, Miss Marple turned to a page from the spring. There, among the modest donations, jam jars, knitted socks, 3 bushels of quinces, was a name written in small light pencil. Anonymous, gift of cookery volumes. It was unmistakably the same hand as the note in the recipe book. Miss Marple removed from her handbag a copy she had made of the note before it vanished. She laid it side by side with the ledger entry. The loop of the F, the slight downward slope of the ER. It was not a scholar's comparison, but an eye trained by years of church rosters, family cards, and flourished thank-you notes. It was Clarissa's hand. She had written the note, not as a confession, perhaps, but as a kind of elegy. A message left not to be read aloud but discovered, and perhaps, once discovered, to explain what she could not speak. Miss Marple understood the impulse. Some women never shouted. They did not storm. They folded their grief into recipes and handkerchief hems, and hoped someone, some quiet listening soul, might one day understand. Clarissa had tried to forgive herself, or her sister, or perhaps even Mrs. Caldwell. The note was not an accusation. It was a sorrow, and someone had stolen it, not to protect Clarissa, but to protect themselves. Because if it became known who had truly been responsible for the fall of Edith Blackwood, more than sorrow would rise from the ashes. It would be justice. The post office at St. Mary Mead was an orderly place, managed by Miss Foster with a devotion bordering on priestly. When Miss Marple arrived on a Wednesday morning under the guise of inquiring about overseas postage, she was greeted with the usual smile and invited behind the desk. Just for a moment, to inspect the parcel scales, which Miss Foster took pride in maintaining to exact tolerances. During their conversation, Miss Marple gently inquired whether any letters had ever been returned to sender that might not have found their way out again. Old things from years ago. Misfiled, perhaps. Miss Foster, flattered by the question and her presumed efficiency, produced a small shoebox marked unclaimed / obsolete. Most were Christmas cards with illegible addresses or uncollected catalogues, but at the very bottom, tied with red string, was a letter. The paper was yellowed, the envelope frayed. It bore a return address, Mrs. Edna Caldwell. The recipient, Miss Edith Blackwood, care of Greythorn Hall, dated January 1911. It had never been opened. Miss Foster, upon inspection, clicked her tongue. Must have been delayed and forgotten. We should have burned it, really. But some things feel, well, sacred, don't they? Miss Marple took the letter gently, fingers resting against the softened paper. Do you mind terribly if I— No, said Miss Foster quickly. I'd trust you with the parish register, Miss Marple. Back home, Miss Marple did not open the letter. She placed it beside the photograph of Edith she had recovered earlier, and looked at both with a calm, steady gaze. Mrs. Caldwell had written to the girl after her dismissal. Perhaps to warn her, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to offer protection too late. But Edith had never seen it, and now the woman who had written it was gone, and the girl who should have read it had died before the post could arrive. Some truths missed their moment. Others waited silent until someone noticed the gap in the bookshelf, the smudge in the handwriting, the note that said only, "Forgive me," It was never meant to be her. Miss Marple exhaled softly. The pattern now was nearly complete. It was a grey afternoon, the sort that blurred the outlines of trees and softened the edges of memory. Greythorn Hall, still stately in its aging bones, welcomed its guests not with grandeur but with quiet solemnity. Miss Marple had requested most politely that the key persons in this strange matter be present in the drawing-room, not under threat nor official summons, merely under the strength of her gentle insistence and the quiet authority she had long since earned. Clarissa Blake arrived first, her features drawn but her posture upright. Leonard Quayle followed, his manner clipped and voice quiet, offering nothing more than civility. Inspector Craddock stood near the fireplace, arms loosely folded, observing all with a patient frown. Mrs. Bantry was there, of course, under the pretext of offering support, but also, and more truthfully, out of interest. And beside her sat Reverend Calthorpe, grave-faced but attentive. Miss Marple stood before the hearth, her hands lightly resting on the back of an old winged chair. Her tone, when she began, was neither dramatic nor stern, simply clear. "I should like," she said softly, "to speak of Edith Blackwood." There was a stillness, not total. No room is ever entirely silent, but waited. "She fell," Miss Marple continued, "down the stairs of this very house. But she did not merely fall, and the reasons why she did, and why those reasons were never spoken of, have shaped everything that followed. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, settled on no one person, and yet each felt seen. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, its quietness inviting attention rather than commanding it. In 1910, Edith Blackwood served as a scullery maid here. She was dismissed just before Christmas, officially for conduct unbecoming, though that was never written in any record. "She was pregnant," murmured Clarissa, barely above a whisper. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "And the father was not a fellow servant, nor someone beneath her station. He was, in fact, someone visiting the hall. A gentleman, though I use the term loosely." She allowed a moment to pass. "That man was Leonard Quayle." Quayle made no protest, only shifted in his seat, a hand tightening around the armrest. "Mrs. Caldwell knew," Miss Marple continued, "or at the very least, suspected. The girl had no one else, and Mrs. Caldwell, though never one to overstep, had a strong sense of obligation to those beneath her care." "She confronted him," said Inspector Craddock quietly. "She did," Miss Marple confirmed, "but not in time. Edith fell, or rather, was pushed. The story was softened, the ledgers were closed. Mrs. Caldwell left her post, and in doing so she chose to remain silent, believing it might preserve some sense of order." "But she protected the wrong one," Clarissa said hollowly. "Yes." Miss Marple's gaze settled on her now. "And she knew it, which is why, before her death, she tried to make amends. In small ways. A letter never sent, a note hidden, a bequest written, not to punish, but perhaps to honor what might have been." The others said nothing. There was too much in the air. Regret, remembrance, and a truth long overdue. Miss Marple's tone grew softer still, as if the memory itself required reverence. "Clarissa, I believe you discovered the truth about Edith after your husband's death. A name, perhaps, or a letter left among his papers. Something that pointed to the past. You believed he had been responsible, and you, already grieving, were left to carry a burden that was not entirely yours." Clarissa sat very still. "I thought it was Philip," she said quietly. "He never spoke of her, but there were signs. a photograph tucked into an old book, an envelope, unsealed, with Edith's name. I blamed him. I blamed myself. And Mrs. Caldwell. I thought she knew. I wrote the note because I didn't know what else to do. A plea, not a confession, Miss Marple murmured. One line, folded into a pudding recipe, left for discovery, but not for scandal. You wanted someone to understand, not to accuse. Clarissa nodded once, as if the act required all the strength she had left. And when the note vanished, Miss Marple continued, you thought perhaps the past would remain buried. But it didn't, Clarissa said faintly. It never does it? No, Miss Marple agreed. Not when someone tries so desperately to silence it again. Not when the truth is being pursued by more than one quiet observer. The room by now felt less like a gathering, and more like a reckoning. Leonard Quayle, who had thus far maintained the brittle demeanor of polite discomfort, now spoke. It was an accident, he said, his voice firm, too firm. She confronted me, said she would tell. I lost my temper. I didn't push her, not really. She stumbled. But you watched her fall, Miss Marple said evenly. And you let Mrs. Caldwell take the weight. He did not respond. You returned to the village not by chance, she continued. You came because Mrs. Caldwell was nearing the end, and you feared what she might reveal. And when the note surfaced, when Elsie Weatherby spoke of the fire and the past, you tried once more to erase what remained. The gas left on, the break-in, the note removed, all to preserve a silence that never truly held. Craddock stepped forward then, but not with urgency. It was not needed. Quayle had gone very still. I didn't think anyone would remember, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Someone always remembers, Miss Marple replied gently, especially when the truth is as unfinished as a pudding without its final spice. And that, at last, was the end of silence. The garden was very still. The laburnum trees, having dropped the last of their yellow blossoms, swayed gently in the breeze, casting shadows like lace upon the lawn. Miss Marple sat with her tea, a thin china cup balanced carefully between her fingers, her eyes turned toward the blooms, but not truly seeing them. The business at the hall had concluded without fanfare. Leonard Quayle had been taken quietly into custody, the process stripped of drama but not of meaning. Clarissa, pale and tremulous, had departed for the coast to rest, though Miss Marple doubted rest would come easily for someone who had carried both guilt and love in such delicate balance. And Mrs. Caldwell, long gone, and yet present in every line of script, every turned page, every carefully saved recipe, lingered in memory, not as a housekeeper, but as a woman who had lived with a decision too heavy to name. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Secrets, she thought, were like heavy preserves. When sealed too tightly for too long, they grew dense, dark, and sometimes dangerous. One cannot keep everything in, nor can one expect the truth, once buried, to stay neatly folded. It had taken time, patience, and the soft tools of observation, a knitting needle here, a cup of tea there. But the truth had come through, as it always did, in the end. Not with clamor, but with clarity. And now, the village was quiet again, but not unchanged. Miss Marple's thoughts wandered, as they often did, to small parables hidden in domestic things. She recalled a tale Mrs. Bantry once told, of a batch of plum jam that refused to set. No matter how long it boiled, no matter how much sugar was added, it remained watery, obstinate, undone. Eventually, it was discovered that the mistake had been simple. One ingredient, left out by accident. Not a large one, not the sugar or the fruit, but the lemon juice, just a teaspoon, It hadn't seemed important, but it was. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Truth, she thought, is rather like that. It doesn't always shout. It doesn't always announce itself as the vital thing. But leave it out, ignore it long enough, and everything changes. The consistency of a life, the shape of a family, the taste of justice. Clarissa had lived for years with a missing truth. So had Mrs. Caldwell. So, in some quiet way, had the whole village. And now, at last, the balance had shifted. The past had spoken. And what had been muddled, sweet, bitter, clouded, had begun to clear. Miss Marple placed her cup upon its saucer and reached for her knitting. A new pattern, she thought. Something lighter, because it was June, and the jam, this year, would set just fine. And so, dear listener, what began with a quiet recipe book and a forgotten note ended with the truth, not loud or dramatic, but spoken gently, like a breeze rustling the laburnum trees. Miss Marple, with her quiet eyes and kind persistence, showed us once again that secrets, no matter how carefully folded into the past, always rise, especially when stitched with guilt, grief, and love left unsaid. In the end, justice did not arrive with a hammer, but with a whisper, a truth long overdue, finally heard. It's a story of how silence can weigh heavier than words, and how even the smallest clues, a hidden letter, a pencil mark, a handwritten recipe, can speak volumes. And perhaps the deepest lesson is this, that the things we don't say often shape our lives far more than the things we do. But tell me this, what do you think would have happened if the note had never been found? Would the past have stayed buried? Or would the truth have found its way through another whisper, another thread? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And your answers help others discover these stories too. If you enjoyed today's mystery, please consider subscribing for more tales of quiet suspense and hidden truths. And do share this story with a friend who loves a good old-fashioned unraveling. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with us. Until the next mystery, keep your tea warm and your eyes open.